Two people walk onto the same used car lot on the same afternoon. Buyer A heads straight for a used Toyota RAV4 hybrid. He paid more than he originally budgeted for, but he didn't hesitate because he had already decided weeks ago that this was the smart move. Buyer B wanders over to a used EV that had been sitting near the back of the lot for almost 2 months. The salesman barely bothered to walk over, figuring she was just killing time before buying something more sensible. Later in this video, these two buyers are going to go through the exact same 5-year ownership test, dollar for dollar. One of them finishes thousands ahead of the other. The surprising part isn't who wins. It's where that advantage actually comes from, and you won't see it coming from where you're standing right now. But we're not ready for that comparison yet, because first you need to understand why buyer A's choice looks so obviously correct that most people would never think to question it. If you've spent any time researching cars over the last year, you already know hybrids are having a moment. Search interest in hybrid SUVs has been climbing steadily. Dealers are reporting that hybrid inventory barely touches the lot before it sells. Consumer Reports keeps putting hybrids near the top of its reliability rankings. Car review channels that used to push electric vehicles as the obvious future are now spending entire episodes explaining why a hybrid might be the smarter buy for most American drivers in 2026. And when you actually look at the reasons, it's hard to argue with any of them. Start with reliability. A Toyota RAV4 hybrid or a Toyota Prius is built on a powertrain that's been refined for almost 3 decades now. Toyota's hybrid system is famous for racking up well past 200,000 miles with nothing more than routine maintenance. There's no giant battery pack that needs replacing at huge expense, no charging network you're dependent on, no range anxiety on a road trip. You put gas in it like you've done your whole life, and it just runs. Then there's the resale value, which is where things start to look almost unbeatable. A 5-year-old RAV4 hybrid can retain somewhere around 60 to 65% of what it cost new. That's an extraordinary number for any vehicle, let alone one that's been driven daily for half a decade. Compare that to a typical gas-powered SUV, which usually settles closer to 55% over the same stretch, and the hybrid wins that fight too. Add in the fuel savings, which is the part most people focus on first. A hybrid can easily save $600 to $900 a year in gas compared to a similar gas-only SUV, depending on how much you drive and what gas costs in your area. Stack 5 years of that together, and you're looking at $3,000 to $4,000 staying in your pocket instead of going into a tank. Now stack all of that up: strong reliability, strong resale, real fuel savings, dealers who can't keep them in stock, reviewers who keep recommending them, friends, family, coworkers, all pointing the same direction. At this point, choosing a hybrid doesn't feel like a financial decision anymore. It feels like the obvious one, the kind of choice nobody questions. And honestly, there's something deeper going on underneath all of that, something that has nothing to do with spreadsheets. Buying a car is one of the biggest financial decisions most people make outside of a house, and almost nobody wants to feel like they got it wrong. So when a buyer pays a little extra for the RAV4 hybrid, instead of risking something unfamiliar, they're not just buying a vehicle, they're buying the feeling of having made a safe choice. They're buying the ability to tell a friend what they bought and get a nod of approval instead of a raised eyebrow. That feeling is worth something. It's just not something that shows up on a price tag, and it's not something most people would admit out loud while they're signing the paperwork. There's a reason that feeling is so powerful. Most car buyers aren't mechanics. They can't pop the hood and evaluate what they're actually looking at. So they lean on signals instead, on what everyone else is buying, on what the reviews say, on what their coworker drives. A crowded lot full of buyers competing for the same hybrid doesn't just raise the price. It also reassures every individual buyer that they must be making the right call, because why else would so many other people be fighting over the same car? That reassurance is real, and for a lot of people, it's worth paying for. The uncomfortable part is that the reassurance and the actual financial outcome are two completely separate things, and most buyers never stop to separate them. So here's the first discovery, and it's going to sound almost too simple to matter at first. Every single advantage we just listed is also the exact reason hybrid prices have climbed as high as they have. Strong reliability drives demand. Strong demand shrinks available inventory. Shrinking inventory pushes prices up. The qualities that make a hybrid desirable are the same qualities making it expensive to actually buy one. That raises a question worth sitting with before we move anywhere else. A great vehicle and a great deal are not automatically the same thing. You can be completely right about a car's reliability, completely right about its reputation, and still end up paying more than that car is actually worth to you personally, simply because everyone else figured out the same thing you did at the same time. Think about how a 2-year-old Honda CR-V hybrid is priced right now. In a lot of markets, it's still commanding close to 90% of what it cost brand new. After 2 years of someone else driving it, putting real miles on the odometer, you're still expected to pay almost what they paid. That's what high demand does to a used market. It erases almost the entire benefit of buying used in the first place. You're not really buying a discounted car. You're buying a car that happens to be 1 or 2 years old and pricing it like it isn't. So are buyers actually paying for value here, or are they paying for reputation? Those two things usually overlap, but they're not the same, and the gap between them is exactly where money quietly disappears. That brings us to the second discovery, and this one takes a little more math to see clearly. Picture a 3-year-old RAV4 hybrid selling for around $30,000, which lines up with what tight inventory in that segment has been doing to prices lately. Now picture a comparable 3-year-old gas-only SUV in the same trim level and mileage range, selling for maybe $27,000. That $3,000 gap is the hybrid premium. It's the price you're paying for the badge on the back, separate from anything the engine itself is doing for you. We already established the fuel savings run somewhere around $600 to $900 a year. Take the middle of that range, call it $750 a year. At that rate, it takes 4 full years of driving just to recover the $3,000 premium through gas savings alone. And that's the best-case version of the math, assuming gas prices stay elevated and you're driving enough miles every year to actually capture those savings. In a lot of real-world cases, the premium runs higher than $3,000, especially on the most in-demand trims, and average commuter mileage lands closer to the low end of that fuel savings range. Run those more realistic numbers, and the recovery period stretches out to 8 or 10 years before fuel savings actually catch up to what you paid extra at the register. Which leads directly into the third discovery. 8 to 10 years is longer than most people keep a car. The average American holds onto a vehicle for somewhere around 6 to 8 years before trading it in or selling it, and plenty of people move on well before that, which means a meaningful number of hybrid buyers right now will sell their car before they ever fully recoup the premium they paid to own it in the first place. They drive off feeling like they made the financially responsible choice, and in a sense they did, just not as completely as the sticker on the lot implied. This is where most people would assume the story is finished. Hybrid demand inflated the price, fuel savings take too long to catch up, some owners never break even. Case closed, hybrids are overpriced, end of video. Except that's not actually the interesting part. The interesting part is the fourth discovery, and it has nothing to do with hybrids at all. It has to do with timing. Depreciation does not hit every owner the same way. It hits hardest in the first few years a car is on the road, then it slows down dramatically. A brand new vehicle of almost any kind loses a huge chunk of its value in the first 3 years. Then the curve flattens out considerably after that, which means the financial pain of depreciation depends enormously on whether you're the first owner who buys it new or a later owner who buys it after most of that drop has already happened. This is exactly where EVs come back into the picture, and it's not in the way you'd expect from how the story has gone so far. While hybrid buyers have been fighting over limited inventory, EVs have been quietly piling up on lots across the country. A used Ford Mustang Mach-E or Hyundai Ioniq 5 can sit for almost 2 months before it sells, nearly double the time a comparable hybrid takes to move. Dealers don't like inventory sitting that long, so they cut prices and they keep cutting until somebody buys. That price cutting compounds with a few other forces working against EV values at the same time. Manufacturers have been slashing prices on new EVs to stay competitive, and every time a new sticker price drops, every used version of that same model instantly looks more expensive by comparison, even though nothing about the used car changed. Certain federal incentives that used to support EV pricing have also gone away, altering the math almost overnight. Battery technology keeps improving fast enough that a 3-year-old EV can feel a full generation behind a brand new one, similar to how a 2-year-old phone starts to feel outdated the moment a new model launches. And plenty of buyers remain nervous about battery health and charging access, which keeps demand soft no matter how good the car actually is to drive. Put all of that together and the depreciation numbers get severe. A lot of EVs are losing somewhere between 57 and 60% of their original value over 5 years. A Volkswagen ID.4 that cost $42,000 new might be worth $15,000 to $17,000 by year 5. A Mustang Mach-E or Ioniq 5 that started in the mid-40s can land in the low 20s by the time it reaches a second owner. Here's the fifth discovery, and it's the one that ties everything together. If you're the first owner watching your EV lose 60% of its value, that loss is real, and it's painful. But that loss is also a transaction. It has to be paid by somebody, and once it's paid, it's gone. It doesn't reset for the next owner. The person who buys that same car used isn't taking on that loss. They're stepping into the part of the depreciation curve where most of the damage has already been absorbed by somebody else's bank account. So now we have two completely different timing stories happening in the same market at the same moment. Hybrid buyers are entering near the top of a demand cycle, paying a premium for a curve that hasn't dropped much yet. Used EV buyers are entering near the bottom of a different curve after most of the damage has already occurred. Same 5 years ahead of them, completely different starting points behind them. Before we run the actual numbers, it's worth pausing here, because if you tried to guess the winner right now, you could make a real case either way, and that's exactly what makes this interesting instead of obvious. Make the case for the hybrid for a second. Buyer A's car holds its value better, year after year, which means if he needs to sell early, he's not going to take a brutal hit the way an EV owner sometimes does. His maintenance costs are simple and predictable, with no battery degradation to worry about and a service network on every corner. He's also saving real money on gas every single month, money he can actually see and feel, not just a number on a 5-year spreadsheet. If gas prices climb over the next few years, that gap only grows in his favor. There's a legitimate version of this story where Buyer A wins clean. Now make the case for the EV. Buyer B's car has already taken its worst hit before she even signed anything, which means there's less room left for it to fall further. Her per-mile cost to drive is often lower than gasoline, especially if electricity prices in her area stay where they are. She didn't pay a premium to feel safe, so she's not carrying that extra cost into every year of ownership the way Buyer A is. If her battery holds up the way most do at this age, she's driving a car that's mechanically simpler underneath, with fewer moving parts to eventually fail. There's a legitimate version of this story where Buyer B wins clean too. Both of those stories can't be fully true at the same time. One of them is going to be closer to what actually happens. And the only way to find out which one is to stop guessing and start adding up real numbers, carefully, one step at a time. Because this is exactly the kind of comparison that falls apart if you rush it. It's also worth saying plainly that no 5-year projection like this is a guarantee. Gas prices could spike or drop. Electricity rates vary enormously depending on where you live and what your utility charges at night versus during the day. A battery that's been babied charges differently than one that's been fast-charged every single day. A hybrid that's been driven gently holds its value differently than one with a rough maintenance history. The numbers that follow aren't a promise about your specific car in your specific driveway. They're a realistic picture of how this tends to play out when you use honest, middle-of-the-road assumptions instead of cherry-picking numbers to make one side look better. Now we finally have everything we need to run that ownership test we mentioned at the beginning. Start with Buyer A. He paid $30,000 for that 3-year-old RAV4 hybrid, which was $3,000 more than a comparable gas-only SUV in the same condition would have cost him. That $3,000 is money out of his pocket on day one before he's driven a single mile. Over the next 5 years, he saves on fuel, Call it $750 a year, which is the middle of the realistic range for someone driving an average amount in an area with typical gas prices. Multiply that by 5 years, and he's saved roughly $3,700 at the pump. Subtract that from what he spent, and he's already clawed back almost all of that original premium just through fuel savings alone, landing him close to even on the purchase decision itself. But owning a car isn't just what you pay and what you save while you drive it. It's also what the car is worth when you're done with it, because that remaining value is money you get back, not money you've lost. A RAV4 hybrid depreciates slowly and predictably, so by year 5, his car is still worth somewhere around $18,000 to $20,000, depending on mileage and how well he's kept it up. That remaining value is his to recover, either by selling it or by trading it toward whatever comes next. Put all 3 pieces together for buyer A. $30,000 spent at the start, $3,700 saved on fuel along the way, $18,000 to $20,000 still sitting in the car when the 5 years are up. Subtract what he saved and what the car is still worth from what he originally paid, and his true cost for 5 years of driving lands somewhere around $6,000 to $7,000. Now do the exact same 3 steps for buyer B, one at a time, so you can see precisely where her numbers diverge from his. She paid $23,000 for that 3-year-old Ioniq 5, a price that reflects the steep depreciation curve we already walked through. That's $7,000 less than buyer A spent at the register, before either of them has driven a single mile in their new car. Over the same 5 years, she also saves around $750 a year, this time on charging instead of gas, for a total of roughly $3,700 saved, almost identical to what buyer A saved. This is an important detail to notice, because it means the fuel and charging savings basically cancel each other out between the two of them. Neither buyer gains a real advantage from that part of the equation. Then there's what her car is worth at the end. Because most of an EV's steepest depreciation happens early, and she bought in after that drop had already occurred, her car only loses a modest amount of additional value during the 5 years she owns it. By year 5, it's worth somewhere around $12,000 to $14,000, noticeably less in dollar terms than buyer A's remaining value, but starting from a much lower purchase price to begin with. Put the 3 pieces together for buyer B the same way we did for buyer A. $23,000 spent at the start, roughly $3,700 saved on charging, $12,000 to $14,000 still sitting in the car at the end. Subtract her savings and her remaining value from what she paid, and her true cost for the same 5 years lands somewhere around $5,000 to $6,000. Lay both totals side by side. Buyer A's true 5-year cost sits around $6,000 to $7,000. Buyer B's sits around $5,000 to $6,000. The gap between them is roughly $1,000 to $2,000 in buyer B's favor. And now you can actually see where every dollar of that gap came from, instead of just being told the answer. It didn't come from fuel versus electricity, because those nearly canceled out. It came from the $7,000 head start she got at the register, partially offset by the fact that her car will be worth several $1,000s less than his by the time the 5 years are over. The first owner of her EV ate the brutal part of that depreciation curve before she ever showed up. She only had to absorb the much gentler decline that happens after a car has already lost most of what it's going to lose. That gap is real, but it's also exactly as narrow as it looks, which matters. This was never a blowout. A slightly higher gas price over those 5 years, a slightly better deal on either car at the lot, a slightly worse battery condition on the EV. Any of those could shrink that gap further or even flip it the other way. What doesn't change is the underlying mechanism, which is that one buyer paid a premium tied to a vehicle near the top of its demand cycle, and the other buyer paid a discount tied to a vehicle that had already endured the worst of its decline. That mechanism is consistent even when the exact dollar amounts move around. Buyer A spent 5 years feeling smart every time he passed a gas station, and he genuinely was saving money in that moment. But the premium he paid to get into a car at the peak of its demand cycle quietly offset a real chunk of that progress before he ever pumped a gallon. Buyer B never thought of herself as the financially savvy one. She bought the car nobody wanted because it was cheap, and she probably spent a few uneasy nights wondering if she'd made a mistake everyone else seemed to be avoiding. In this case, cheap turned out to be the smarter math, not because the EV was a better car, but because she bought it at a better point in its life, at a price that already reflected someone else's loss instead of asking her to create a new one of her own. None of this means a hybrid premium is always the wrong move, so let's look at where paying it actually makes sense. Picture a buyer who drives well above the national average, somewhere around 20,000 miles a year for work. At that kind of mileage, fuel savings stack up far faster, often cutting that break-even period down to 3 or 4 years instead of 8 to 10, which makes the premium worth paying almost immediately. Picture a buyer who plans to keep the next car for 15 years instead of 5. Stretch the ownership window out that long, and even a slow recovery period becomes irrelevant because there's plenty of time left after breaking even to enjoy pure savings. And picture a buyer without reliable charging access at home or nearby. For that person, the lower price of a used EV doesn't matter much if charging becomes a weekly hassle and the hybrid's simplicity becomes worth real money on its own. In each of those cases, the math shifts in the hybrid's favor, not because the depreciation numbers changed, but because the buyer's situation changed what those numbers actually mean for them. So step back from the RAV4 and the Ioniq 5 for a second, because the real lesson here was never really about those two specific cars. It's about a pattern that shows up everywhere in this market, and probably in markets you haven't even thought to look at yet. A great vehicle is not automatically a great deal. Those two things get treated like they're the same thing constantly, on dealer lots, in comment sections, in conversations with well-meaning relatives who swear by whatever they're driving. But reputation and price are two separate variables, and the market doesn't always let you have both at once. Sometimes a car earns its reputation fairly, and the price simply hasn't caught up yet, and that's a real bargain. Other times, like with a lot of hybrids right now, the reputation is completely deserved, and the price has caught up so thoroughly that it's already absorbed most of the benefit before you ever get behind the wheel. A bad deal can hide inside a great reputation. That's the part that's hardest to see from the inside of the decision, because everything about buying the trusted, reliable, highly recommended car feels correct while you're doing it. Nobody warns you about overpaying for a RAV4 hybrid the way they'd warn you about a sketchy private seller or a car with a salvage title. The risk here isn't dishonesty, it's popularity. And popularity is a much harder thing to be suspicious of. A bargain can hide inside a bad reputation just as easily. The used EV sitting at the back of the lot doesn't look like an opportunity. It looks like something other buyers already rejected for good reason. Sometimes that instinct is correct, but sometimes what you're actually looking at is a car that already survived the worst financial event in its life cycle, and what's left is simply a quieter, cheaper version of the same daily transportation everyone else is competing to buy at full price. None of this is an argument that EVs are secretly superior or that hybrids are secretly a trap. The cars themselves aren't lying to you. The market is just pricing them based on how everyone feels about them right now, not based on what they'll actually cost you to own. That gap between feeling and cost is where the real opportunity lives, on either side of this comparison, in either direction, depending on which way the crowd happens to be leaning at the moment you're shopping. Buyer A drove off feeling like he made the responsible, well-researched choice, and in plenty of ways he did. Buyer B drove off in a car nobody else wanted, privately wondering if she'd just made a mistake, and 5 years later, she spent less to land in almost the exact same place. So here's what's actually worth carrying with you the next time you're standing on a lot. Looking at the car everyone insists is the smart buy, the one with the waiting list and the glowing reviews and the friend who already owns 3 of them. Don't ask whether it's a good vehicle. It probably is. Ask a harder question instead. Has everyone else already agreed with you so completely that there's nothing left in the price for you to actually gain?